Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Sun. I'm Secretary of Fox Christi Metro DC Baltimore. And a few weeks ago, I had the joy of joining the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines with Michelle Sherman, a Fox Christi USA staff member in DC at the Philippine Human Rights Act lobby days, where we met with over 40 folks, volunteers, met with dozens and dozens of different congressional offices, sharing more about the act, and I think gaining at least a half dozen co-sponsors in addition to what is already on there. So without further ado, I want to introduce Vivian Orand, who is with Malaya Baltimore, and she will be co-presenting with Preston McMillan from the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines today for our Fox Christi Metro DC Baltimore August 11 a.m. discussion. So Vivian and Preston, if you will both like to just take it away, feel free.
All right, will do. Thank you very much, Jessica. So as was just said, I am Vivian Arend. I'm a member of Malaya Baltimore, which is the Baltimore chapter of an international movement among the Filipino diaspora for human rights in the Philippines, as well as confronting the legacy of the Ferdinand Marcos regime and martial law. Presenting with me today is Preston McMillan from the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, more specifically TERP-CHIRP, the University of Maryland chapter. I'm going to pass this over to him to introduce himself a little further, as well as start us off on our presentation today.
Hey, I'm Preston McMillan from TERP-CHIRP, which stands for the Terrapin Human Rights of the Philippines at University of Maryland. And I am fun fact about me, I'm a neuroscience major at the University of Maryland. So let's get started. So essentially, inside the Philippines, we have a human rights situation that we want to go into specifically under the current regime of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who was recently elected a little over a year ago. So yeah, we can take it away. Next slide. So one of the key things to note about the human rights situation in the Philippines is the war on drugs. So with the war on drugs, it started under Rodrigo Duterte. Same day he took office, he declared a war on drugs, and he talked about how he said that he wanted to kill suspected drug addicts and dealers, and urged citizens to do so as well. Meanwhile, and then after that, he just led to the killings of many, many people, likely at least 30,000. And this led to, and what he did, his tactics for doing this was a systemic exaggeration of the drug problem there while he was doing this. And this established a culture of impunity, which led to the breakdown of the government for the people and the rule of law within the police and the military. This culture of impunity and the culture of violence and extrajudicial killings is still there and present, and it led to the silencing of dissent and the assassination of political opponents. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he claims that he wants to make some change and stuff. So by the way, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who declared martial law during the 60s and established his own culture of impunity. Marcos Jr. is the current president of the Philippines. His vice president is his elder Rodrigo Duterte, the former president, which kind of shows the culture of nepotism that's present inside the government as well. But yeah, this led to at least 342 drug-related killings inside his first year, which is actually more than Rodrigo Duterte's last year, pointing to no, nothing has changed. And at least 37 deaths of dissenting officials have occurred under Marcos as well. His tactics tend to be more discreet, and he tends to keep a lot hidden and swept under the rug. And no changes have occurred. Fear and intimidation has risen. And yeah, he continually tries to say, oh, yeah, we're going to do this differently. And not only has nothing changed, things seem to be worsening. But yeah, we can go to the slide. So one of the tactics that Marcos uses is this tactic called red tagging. It's been present for a long time. And essentially, it's when those concerned with human rights are tagged as communists or terrorists. So how does this work? Well, it works by public posting the victim's face and personal information to many places, such as social media, buildings, and more. And this puts them in extreme danger of extrajudicial arrests and killings and murder, sometimes at the hand of the AFP and the PMP and other connected paramilitary groups. The victims are usually underrepresented and intensely oppressed groups, such as the peasants, the fisherfolk, and the indigenous people. And anyone who opposes the government can be red tagged, and it tends to be anyone who does so. It does not matter if they have communist ties or not. And the exact numbers of who is red tagged is very hard to find just because of how it works. They post it pretty discreetly and all that. And it's just a public posting, so it's very hard to get numbers. And now we can go into some recent victims of this. So each of these victims were advocates for human rights. And I would like to stress that inside April 2022, Kathy Chang was a reverend who was red tagged for working for United Church of Christ in the Philippines. They are very vocal about human rights there. And yet she was red tagged. And it just kind of shows that they don't care who it is, and that even the people here would be in danger of being red tagged as well. There are other examples too, such as Stephen Talley, who's an environmental activist who was kidnapped and tortured. The Cordelia People's Alliance 4, all of these activists are red tagged. Percy Lapid, who simply criticized the government, and the Fausto family, the most recent example, who were farm workers and activists, and they were stalked and red tagged by the AFP before they were murdered. It was a very brutal murder too, from the details I've read, but we don't need to go into the details. But yeah. So what is our stake as the United States? How does this go? So our stake in the United States is that the United States, we've sent billions of dollars worth of arms and funding to the AFP and APMP. These guys not only make weapons, they distribute weapons, and they're the ones who conduct the murders. The taxpayer money is going to the human rights of killings of activists such as ourselves. And the exact number I'm not sure about, but I know it's quite high. And this money could be used for many domestic issues, such as more. I mean, maybe type in the chat about what exactly money could be used for instead of killing human rights activists in the Philippines. Higher education, that's one, yes. Healthcare as well. Those are two examples, and there's more as well, such as minimum wage and stuff as well. And he justified the money by talking about stopping China, but the money's going towards domestic arms, not naval arms or opposition. There are over 4 million Filipinos in the US, and many of which have family members in the Philippines who are at risk of being victims as well. In fact, they don't care if you're a US citizen or not. For example, an American citizen such as Brandon Lee, the victim of red tagging and a violent attack. Now to discuss Brandon Lee, I'll start off to Vivian from Malaya.
Thank you so much for giving us a systemic overview, Preston. So I'm going to talk about an example that is on the minds of many of us fighting for human rights in the Philippines. Brandon Lee is significant, both because he was the first American to be a target of violence as a result of red tagging in the Philippines, and also because we are approaching the 4-year anniversary of said attack. So Brandon Lee is a Chinese American activist who had been living in the Philippines while working as a paralegal and human rights advocate for the Ifugao peasant movement and the Cordillera People's Alliance, defending the rights of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. The Cordillera region has been a recent focus of resource extraction within the Philippines, having over 200 mining project applications and more than 100 energy projects, most of which are or would be taking place on indigenous land without permission from the peoples who live there. These projects would also make much of the land practically unusable to the people who live there for farming or fishing. It would poison the rivers and the land. Any attempt to protest these projects has been met with increased militarism, police brutality, and even bombings, all of which are justified by the Philippine government through the red tagging of activists. In 2015, Brandon Lee was tagged as an enemy of the state along with several other activists for opposing the construction of a hydroelectric dam. Since then, he had consistently been surveilled and harassed by the 54th Infantry Battalion of the Philippine military. On August 6th, 2019, Lee was shot multiple times outside his home in what many believe to be an attempted assassination carried out by the armed forces of the Philippines. Luckily, he survived, but the attack has left him paralyzed from the neck down and necessitated multiple surgeries. Despite the attempt on his life, Brandon Lee remains a human rights advocate to this day. Stories like this, red tagging, harassment, and attempted murder, are unfortunately common in the Philippines, and sadly, survivors like Brandon Lee are rare. Just a year before the failed assassination attempt, fellow activist Ricardo Mayumi was killed under similar circumstances. Today, 4 years after the shooting, there has still been no investigation into the events of August 6th, 2019. The Philippine government insists that there is insufficient evidence to warrant an investigation. In those 4 years, U.S. aid to the Philippine military and the number of extrajudicial killings perpetrated under the Philippine anti-terror bill continue to rise, especially under the Marcos Jr. regime. Things are becoming increasingly dire. This may be a little short notice, but for those of you who are available tomorrow afternoon, we will be having a vigil for Brandon Lee, marking the 4 years since his attempted assassination, in which he has still not been given justice. It will be held at 4:30 p.m. outside Congressman Kawasi Mfume's office on 1010 Park Avenue in Baltimore. For those who are familiar with the area, it's right near the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. Our goal would be to get the attention of our local politicians so that they might put diplomatic pressure on the Philippines to investigate Brandon Lee's case. There will be speeches in which you can learn more about the situation in the Philippines, as well as some cultural presentations. I know this has a bit of a short turnaround time, but we would really love to have some of you come out. And I am now going to pass things back to my co-presenter, Preston, to talk about some current legislation that you may already be a little familiar with that could potentially improve the situation. Take it away, Preston.
So the legislation I'm just talking about is the Philippine Human Rights Act, which I think might be AR 1433 inside the House. Yes, it is HR 1433. And it is a proposal to suspend the security assistance to the AFP and the PMP until the human rights situation in the Philippines improves and the human rights abuses stop. I think the Philippines deems the US a very strong economic partner, and thus they would abide if the government takes action. They don't really have a choice, which is what a lot of people who oppose the bill seem to be afraid of, that they would not abide and that they would retaliate. I don't see why they would. Of course, in terms of the bill, there are ways they can get the assistance back as well, as long as their abuses stop. So what can you do to get this bill passed? You can reach out to your local legislator, like your local representative or local senator. you can raise awareness and support among constituents in your district. You get involved with an organization, or this is a big one, you can urge a church organization to endorse and sign on the bill, and they can, and you can fill out our outreach letter and urge your church to endorse and sign on to the bill. And yeah, in terms of that, is
So
we
for those who
have-
are interested in getting like a little more information and maybe getting involved with AIR orgs, we have our emails here. We also have the information on the vigil. And now that we have given this presentation, we'd like to open the floor up for any questions that you have.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you guys coming and letting us know about this. We, have over the years, seen a little bit in the news, but certainly not as much, especially since the election last year in the Philippines. So I guess one of the things is too, you gave us a few good things to follow up on, but I guess one of the things is, there's quite a few Filipino Americans who are Catholic, who are in the 3 Catholic dioceses, which Pax Christi Metro DC Baltimore are involved with. So we could, I think, try to help in that way. And I guess another question I have is there a list that we could see of different groups, faith groups and other groups who have signed on as supporters of the bill? So I'll leave it at that.
I
is-
also wanted to ask about the bill numbers in the Senate and in the House.
Yes, so the bill number in the, I believe, House is HR 1433. It currently has only one co-sponsor from Maryland. I believe that is Senator Van Hollen, but I could be wrong on that. As for the earlier question on a list of church organizations that have already signed on to the co-sponsor the bill, I don't think I have access to a list off the top of my at hand at the moment, but I can ask around and see if I can get that and email it out afterwards.
Also, just to add context on how many offices have signed on to the PHRA, it's important to note that this is actually the second session that the PHRA has been introduced, and in the first session there were 39. So a lot of what's going on right now, especially with the lobby days, is just putting it back on the schedule of a lot of the people who signed on.
John, why don't you go, and then Art, why don't you go afterwards?
I was just going to say thanks. The HR 1433 is in the House of Representatives, and there's only one co-sponsor from either Maryland or Virginia, and that person is Jamie Raskin. And there's currently no related bill in the Senate. So that's what I learned. I put some of that information in the chat. That was all. Thank you for the thanks to the presenters and for this information.
Art, why don't you go?
Okay, I'd like to ask this. Back in 2021, an editor named Maria Ressa won the Nobel Peace Prize for her extraordinary editorial work and activism. Can you talk about what's going on with her and what her influence has been for the human rights movement in the Philippines, please?
Yes, could you repeat that name for me one more time?
Maria Ressa, Ressa, won the
Maria
Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. And she's an editor in one of the newspapers in the Philippines and has been arrested and rearrested by the Philippine government. And I assume she's still alive, but I don't know. I haven't heard much about her.
Okay, thank you very much. I can't say I am super familiar with Maria Ressa's, like what is going on with Maria Ressa at this very moment, but I can talk generally about the situation for like alternative media sources in the Philippines right now, which is that much like what you have shared, a lot of critical news sources in the Philippines are having journalists be red tagged, arrested, tortured, and even like directly the way of spreading this information is being attacked. Like it was, I can't remember exactly what year, but there was a incident in which several alternative media sources in the Philippines had their websites they had like a DDoS attack, which essentially overloads a website such that it shuts down. And they had hired a firm to essentially look into the source of these attacks, and it linked back directly to the Philippine media. So there's a large concentrated effort to silence any critical media in the Philippines at the moment.
This is Bob Cook again. I know, I mean, the Philippines was just such a, when Marcos Ferdinand was in power, and the ability of the Filipino people to rise up and non-violently overthrow him was really a great message to the world. So I know it saddens all of us to see, what's happened in the next generation. So, we would like to be able to, do a small part in helping out. So one of the questions I have, do you know if you guys are working with an organization called WISC? It's Washington Interfaith Staff Coalition. And these are people who work on Capitol Hill and from, all different faith groups. And is there anybody from WISC that is working on the bill that you know of?
To my knowledge, no, I can't say I'm very familiar with WISC, but it is something that I think would be good for us to look into in the future.
Okay, yeah, we'll be glad to try to do that, because it is like, even with the some of the Protestant groups that have this the Methodist building on Capitol Hill, if you're familiar with that, but the UCC Church has an office there, so I'm sure they're involved, the Presbyterian Church, but a lot of the other churches and other faith groups, I'm sure would like to get involved. So we'll try to help make some of those connections if those are needed.
Yes, thank you so much. I've like already in this meeting, I have so many new things to look into.
The Catholic Church was very involved in the protests about the original Marcos. Can you tell me what involvement the Catholic Church has now in the Philippines?
Yes, absolutely. The Philippines has a really rich history of faith-based activism, especially going back to the martial law era. A name that I'm sure this person got bullied for a lot in seminary school, but Cardinal Sin was a very vocal opponent of Marcos. And looking towards today, there's a lot of faith-based activist work that is specifically being done to help the poor in the midst of an economic crisis. I know specifically the Rural Missionaries of the Philippines was an organization that recently had several nuns get red tagged for essentially trying to give economic aid to some of the rural poor in that were like farm workers who could not afford their own land. And I think 7 nuns were arrested for that. The Catholic Church plays a very large role in a lot of the activism that is going on in the Philippines.
It sounds like El Salvador all over again.
There are a lot of parallels, yes.
Art?
Yeah, I'd like to, you all referred to the previous activism that led to the expulsion of Marcos and his family, original. And that took many years and finally happened. And what I wonder is, how in the world did things get turned around to get to Duterte and Marcos Jr. back in power? I'm going to just assume, without knowing anything, that the United States probably spent millions or more dollars to promote those guys, because that's what we do. But can you shed any light on what happened? I mean, it was such a great victory, and how in the world are people electing these criminals and advocates of violence and terror as their leaders? You know, we may do it again for ourselves for Trump, and I don't understand that too much, and I don't understand what happened in the Philippines at all. It was really a shock to me. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. The People's Power movement that ousted the original Marcos is really a source of inspiration for many of us who are in this field of activism for the Philippines. I can say that as far as the re-election of Marcos and even the election of Duterte, a lot of it comes down to where wealth lies. The Duterte campaign was, aside from being part of a larger global swing towards like far-right populist movements, had a lot of funding from the Marcos family, who were using some of the wealth that they had stolen from the Filipino people during the original Ferdinand Marcos regime. And that really propelled him to victory and allowed a lot of historical revisionism to portray the martial law period as a period where it was very peaceful, very economically prosperous, when it truly is not the case. As far as the election of the current Marcos, a lot of people dispute that it was a fair election. Is the official stance of like most orgs that it was a rigged election, and it was, even under Duterte, a lot of campaigning for the like opposing candidate, Leni Robredo. Was any sort of activism for that campaign was red tagged. Even my cousin, who was a student like organizer, he was doing very basic campaigning for what was really a milquetoast liberal candidate for the Philippines. Like, she was not proposing anything radical, and his student organization got red tagged. As for why all of this is sort of promoted and allowed to happen on the international stage, is unfortunately the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is serving US economic interests. He's much more favorable towards resource extraction within the Philippines that is really beneficial to the multinational corporations that fund a lot of US campaigning. So unfortunately, it is a product of neocolonialism that the return of the Marcos family to power.
Can I be heard? This is Tony on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Do you know anything about this play on Broadway that's about Imelda Marcos? And if you do, what's your opinion of it?
Yes, I'm very aware, very disappointed as a longtime Talking Heads fan. But the Broadway play, Here Lies Love, it's very much a work of historical revisionism to downplay the horrible exploitation that the Marcos family had on the Philippines and portray them as victims. Many of the original cast are directly connected to the Marcos family and the stolen wealth that was extracted from the Philippines during the martial law era. It's very sad to see this kind of historical revisionism being promoted in such a mainstream venue.
Luann?
I just wanted to add that I believe in the last week in the Washington Post, there's an article about the naval defense system in the Pacific, which the U.S. is kind of ramping up because of their their problems with diplomacy with China. And one of the main sections of that sort of circle or semicircle of naval defense system is the Philippines. So it's not just the arms industry that wins by having a ally like Marcos there. But it's also the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military. And I think this may be one of the challenges of the bill in the sense that we may hold strings concerning our purse, but they hold strings in terms of allowing the U.S. naval bases and use of ports, etc., in the Philippines as a counter to that. So we're sort of up against considerable problems now that we've made China an enemy more than a supplier of all our electronic equipment, which makes us, dependent upon them. So I'm just mentioning that might be a major problem in getting support in the Congress from the Hawks.
Yes, this has already been a problem we've been coming up against on our lobbying days for the PHRA. The Philippines is very much used as a naval outpost for the US. They are even now expanding the number of naval bases on the Philippines. And there is extreme connections between the United States and Philippine military. How we have been addressing this within lobbying is that for starters, the Philippine Human Rights Act does not affect United States bases in the Philippines. It would only reduce funding for the armed forces of the Philippines itself. And on top of that, part of it is calling for an examination of where the US funds are being spent by the armed forces of the Philippines. Obviously, no one really supports more warmongering with China, but in playing to our audience, we have to point out that a lot of the funds that get sent by the US are going to, rather than the armed forces of the Philippines, they're going to the Philippine National Police, being used on handguns and grenades, which do not make sense in terms of defending against China, because those are not, if it's a naval power that you are up against, it doesn't make sense that this money is going towards handguns. It's very clear that this is primarily being used against the Filipino people themselves. And part of the PHRA would be to examine where the money that is being sent actually goes. That has been our solution for addressing that within lobbying thus far.
So will that be a first step then to try to say invoke the Leahy law? Because again, the Leahy law says that the United States should not be giving military money to a foreign country when they use it against their own citizens. And And usually you have to prove that, so it almost sounds like to me that this would be a first step to try to identify, who's getting these weapons and if they're being used against Filipinos. Do you have any? Am I sort of correct on that, or?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And it's a bit of a complicated situation because there is an ongoing civil war in the Philippines. And part of red tagging is to make it so that a lot of the civilians who are being targeting, they are claiming them to be part of these armed groups that are fighting the current Philippine government, regardless of whether or not they actually have ties to these groups. And that has been sort of the core of the principle of red tagging. And it's difficult given that the United States has incentive to side with the Philippine government as it serves their economic interest to not see a lot of issues with how the Philippines is carrying out operations, but that is our goal, to call attention to the just sheer number of civilian casualties that are occurring over there for any sort of outspokenness against the current government.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions? I guess the one thing is, yeah, we would, I know I personally, I think all of us would like to see how we can work with you locally. I'm going out of town this afternoon, unfortunately, because otherwise I probably would have been at Camden Yards tomorrow afternoon, and then I could have done something good after Camden Yards, after the baseball game, and joined you guys. But I won't be able to do that. But we be glad to try to see in whatever ways we can to try to to help a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. We would be so happy to have anyone who can make it to the vigil tomorrow. I know it's short notice. I can't even make it. I got called into work last minute on that evening, but that's part of working for a hospital. But in the future, right now, the PHRA is a big topic for us, and we will also be more than happy to keep everyone over at PAX Christi informed of all of our other initiatives. I'm really thankful that you guys had us come out and give this presentation. It's been a wonder working with you all so far.
And it's so sad, to see that it's coming around again,
Absolutely. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and it's just important to keep up the fight.
Vivian, if you don't mind me asking, what hospital do you work for? Because Art Milholland, as I mentioned before, used to work at a hospital in Baltimore. So I'm just wondering what hospital you're associated with.
Yes, I'm a lab technician over at St. Agnes Hospital right now.
Great.
It was actually their nurses are in the process of unionizing, which is something very exciting for us.
Good. Yeah. Anybody else? Anything? Okay, well, thank you. You really informed us before Jessica let us know. I didn't know this bill was out there, and yeah, this is something we should definitely, I think, try to support you in as much as you can. So thank you for educating us on this.
Thank you so much for having us here. It means a lot to be able to come out and share all of this information. That it's something that I'm personally very passionate about.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming out and presenting. And I look forward to future partnership with PAX Christi, DC Baltimore, and the local efforts especially, and just more joining of hands and forces.
Thank you so much.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Take care. We'll be in touch.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone. God bless.